for the invite. I think that we can start directly to the, okay, no, thank you. Thank you again for the invitation, especially to consider INEGI in this opportunity to share with all of you the products, the statistical and geographical products that we are doing in INEGI. Let me introduce myself for starting our conversation today here. My name is Gerardo Durán Alcántara. I'm Deputy Director General of Economic Records at INEGI. And in this charge, I'm in the responsibility to produce statistics using records, especially in the field of economics. So in this case, I'm also with the responsibility to update our business register, that is the directory of establishment that we have in the country. So it's important to consider this directory because it's the basis for elaborating all the economic statistics that we have in the side of the economic programs at INEGI. And it's strategic, especially why? Because it's useful for policy making. And in this opportunity also the contact with the academics is for us very interesting because it's the opportunity also to be aware of the research, of all the aspects that are necessary for doing investigation in the side of the academics. And of course, we are expecting enriching our activity as part of this discussion today here, and many thanks again for the invitation. So no more to add in this opening. So I don't know, colleagues, Craig, Jim, if you want to start with some comments, and afterwards perhaps I can share with you some of the aspects that I would like to comment, to share regarding the economic census program, that is the backbone for also updating the business register in the country, and also for creating the frames for business surveys in INEGI. I don't know, Jim, please.
Yeah, bienvenidos a San Diego, a todos ustedes de UABC y de CETIS, y no sé si hay personas de cola, pero están muy bienvenidos. This is a real pleasure for me to be here and to be able to see what I think is one of the strongest, most competent, useful institutions in Mexico, which is now going to have a presence on the campus here. It's a fantastic opportunity for all of us in the region to have INEGI here. So, thanks for coming, and thanks for enduring the wait time at the border and all that to get here. And I hope that it's a productive day for you. Thank you.
Igualmente, bienvenidos aquí en San Diego. My name is Craig McIntosh. I'm a professor at the School of Global Policy and Strategy here. I think I know probably much less about the big picture of INEGI and the Censo Económico than my co-panelists. What I would like to do is talk about a specific project that I've been working on for the last few years, which is completely dependent on the INEGI data, and I think is just an incredible sandbox, if you will, of data that opened up these possibilities that I'm still amazed at the depth and the breadth of the analysis that we're able to do, and it's entirely because of the INEGI data. So I'll be speaking more or less to a fairly specific example. I think it makes sense maybe I go last. So.
My example is specific also.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Jim and Craig, and it's good to know that the information that we are producing at INEGI, the Statistical Office, and geographic information also, we have these two responsibilities useful for many aspects, and for that we are really interested in receiving input, feedback, comments in order to improve our work at INEGI. That is part of the essence of the responsibility that we have, based in fact in the statistical law that we have in Mexico. So I would like to start with this presentation. Well, let me start with the economic census. What is the economic census? The economic census and the purpose is to provide information at the more disaggregated level, considering not strictly the geographic areas in the country, because we have details from countries, states, municipalities, counties, localities, in fact, neighborhoods and especially blocks in the cities. This is the advantage of the census. We are also considering the more powerful of the census, taking into account the variables, a lot of variables in the economic side that we are collecting in this survey, that is the census that we are carrying out in INEGI. Is focused to the establishments. We are considering the establishments in basically the activities that are non-agricultural. Why? Because the agricultural is part of other census, that is the agricultural and livestock census that we are carrying out approximately each 10 years. I said approximately because our last census, that was the census agricultural and livestock in 22, was carried out after 15 years because the prior census was carried out in 2007. So with that, is for us important to point out that we are expecting receiving budget for the purpose to carry out regularly each 10 years that census. In the case of the economic census, so non-agricultural activities, in this case I'm talking about the trade, wholesale and retail, financial services, mining, fishing, manufacturing, construction, all the activities non-agricultural. So with that, this is the scenario of the census. This census, fortunately for us, has a long history, more than 90 years. We started this history in 1930. So with this idea, the census, when we collect the information of the economic census, as you can see in this slide, the following economic census will be carried out in 24. So we are collecting information related to the prior year, in this case from January to December of the prior year, in order to investigate all the activities related to the establishments that we have in the country. Oops, we are waiting for the next slide.
Give me a minute.
No problem, thank you. So the history of the census is also very important in order to provide a long time series in an annual basis. It's the opportunity to check how is the structure of the country, especially in the case of the activities, as I said, non-agricultural. Well, in this slide, I would like to comment that as part of the integration and the relationship that we have with the United States and Canada, we are using the North American Industry Classification System, that is the NAICS. This classification system allowed to INEGI to produce comparable statistics basically in the field of economics. This is a great advantage, including the possibility to extend the analysis to the socio-demographic for using NAICS to give an order to the activities that we have, not strictly in the establishment, also in the persons, the individuals that are, for example, employees in the economic units. So the census provide responses to the questions that I'm showing in the slide. For example, what is produced, how much, the amount. We are investigating several variables. We have special interest in the case of the revenues, for example, expenses of the establishments. Where is located the production? Of course, the establishments in the case of across the country, from the north to south, in considering all the territory. How are producing the establishments? Of course, we are considering, based in the NAICS, the business function in order to give the right economic activity to the establishments in this case. And with what? What are the resources used by the establishments for carrying out their activity? As I said, is the basis, so the economic census, as you can see in the last part of the slide, for updating our statistical business register. In other words, is the directory of economic units that we have in our country. Well, continuing with that, so the observation unit that we have in the case of the economic census, that is part also of the agreements that we have in the field of the communication with the Statistical Division of United Nations, because many times we consider two kinds of observation units, enterprise and establishments. In our case, we are considering establishment. Why? Because it's the possibility to also identify where is located specifically an establishment. Many cases, the enterprise, you can, for example, identify the headquarters, but not strictly where are all the establishments that are related to the headquarters. So we prefer to talk about, I don't know, if we are considering Walmart Mexico, okay, the headquarters is in Mexico City, but we have a lot of Walmarts across the country. So we are in the idea to identify all the Walmarts from Baja California to Quintana Roo in order to facilitate the analysis specifically at the regional level. So for that, the establishments are important. As I pointed out, for example, we are considering, of course, in the side of manufacturing, the factories, in the case of wholesale and retail stores, shops, mines, in the case of the mining, fishing, service establishments, etc. So for us, it's very, very important to take into account the usefulness of establishment because it's also strongly linked to the cartography view that we have, this geographical view that is useful for give more potential thinking in the use that we can give afterwards when we are producing the information of the economic census. Okay, what does the economic census provide? Basically, we are considering these 4 analytical dimensions. The first one is historic. As I pointed out, we started the history of the economic census more than 19 years ago. We have the opportunity to see the structure of the economic activity of Mexico in this perspective, in this historic perspective. Thematic is also important because it's the opportunity to gathering information of more than 200 variables. We are considering, for example, the address of the establishment, the name, the legal name, in order to be sure that we are identifying rightly the establishment, of course, and linking this information with all the data that we are collecting regarding revenues, employees, other economic variables that are useful, and in fact, as part of the investigation that we are doing regularly, for example, characteristics of the employees, etc. Sectoral, for us, is important because it's the opportunity to also compare with the other countries, our main partners, United States and Canada, and of course, with the other programs that we have in INEGI. Why? Because it's also the opportunity to create the frameworks, the frames for elaborating business surveys in this case. And finally, the potential of the geographic perspective is useful because we can go from the general perspective at the national level to the block in a city, for example. No, this is one of the great advantages that we have in the case of the economic census. So the thematic areas that I mentioned, just to give more explanation about that, for example, the operation period is the 4 bullet that you can see there, is useful especially to identify if the establishments are alive or not. Why? Because if you consider the impact, the negative impact of the pandemic by COVID-19, now this census in 24 is also the opportunity to investigate what about the establishments that we have before the pandemic, and now in 24, considering the negative impact, is necessary to evaluate if we have really a recovery or not. No? And depends on the regions, the size of the establishment, the activities. So for that, it's important this operation period. We are expecting, or at least we are considering, we trust that many establishments, at least medium or a big, large establishment, that they are remaining in the activity. So this is our expectation in the case of medium and large establishment. Unfortunately, in the case of small, the case and micro and small establishments, unfortunately, many of them are now dying. No? This is one of the problems that we are facing. Of course, employees, wages and salaries, expenses, revenues, the value of production, stocks, fixed assets, the ICT usage, very important because it's now the opportunity to also connect again to the economic activity. We are now identifying that many establishments are reinventing activities through the use of social networks, for example. No? So it's very, very interesting aspect that we are also investigating. So in more detail, we have some disaggregation in different perspectives. The case that I pointed out, the case of the sex of employees and owners, the formality of the business. Prior, Marta, Jim, and I were discussing about the informality in the case of Mexico is not strictly for not paying taxes. In many cases, is just because we are in the establishment that are using, for example, part of the house. I don't know, the garage for offering, I don't know, food, the lunches, something like that. So we are also investigating this kind of establishments as informal. So we are with the idea always to collect in the side of the formal activity and the non-formal activity. The means of payments, the form of organization, for example, if this is a unique establishment or not, or if this establishment is part of an enterprise, The characteristics of the employees, the educational level is also relevant for us. The management of the business, for example, the improvement proposals, the case of if they are doing, for example, research and development, there we have a specific questions to investigate that. And in the dimension of the geographic, as I pointed out, the case of the detail that we have regarding the information available from the national level to AGEP. The AGEP is the division of the country for statistical purposes, especially to organize the collection of the census, and it's also useful for presenting, for disseminating our results. So the case of the legal name of the enterprise, in this case of each establishment, we have a special interest in the right column, for example, to investigate the destination market. Now the global value chains are a reality, so we are specifically investigating if there is a connection or not with global value chains. And in fact, during the pandemic, we were aware that part of the growth of the Mexican economy, if you can really consider growth in the 20 and 21 with the pandemic, was related to the activities to the external sector. And okay, what are the establishments behind this low level of growth, but finally growth? So we are in this idea also investigating this information with the economic census. And finally, the case of financing and the use of credits from banks, suppliers, etc. The usefulness of the information relevant because in this slide we are showing the connection that we have between the economic programs at INEGI. In the center, you can see the two censuses, the agricultural and livestock and the economic census. In the right, the case of the NAICS, the classification that we are using for that. In the left, the Statistical Business Register, the acronym in Spanish is RENEM, and in the bottom part, you can see in the left, national accounts, that is also using all the basic statistics that we're producing as a result of the economic census, especially for the calculations of the most relevant indicator that we have, that is the gross domestic product, of course, and many indicators of short term related to the GDP. Business surveys, that is the opportunity to take a look about the evolution, the activities in basically 4 sectors of the economy. We have the case of trade, retail and wholesale, the case of construction, manufacturing, and we are also investigating the non-financial services. 4 sectors of our economy are strictly linked to the economic census that provides the frame for doing the samples that we are using for collecting the information. And of course, the relevance of the price indices, particularly, you know, the consumer price index and the producer price index as part of the idea to identify the rise of prices and the inflation particularly. The use of administrative records is in the bottom for feeding all the aspects that we are considering in this relationship among all these aspects of the economic program. So we are in a cycle of 5 years because in the year that we started with the economic census, previously we have defined the NAICS, the use of the North American Industry Classification System, updated as a result of the discussion that we have with the United States and Canada in this opportunity of our trilateral agreement. And with these NAICS revised and updated, we are using the NAICS updated in the economic census as the first program for collecting the data. And afterwards, we are using also this info for updating the samples based on the revision of the frames that we have in business. And with this, we are also considering the relevance of the weight for weighting the economics in the several measurements that we have. For example, the structure of the economy is changing. So with that, we are aware that it's needed to update also the structure of weighting in, I don't know, for example, now we have in the non-financial services more relevance in the case of the use of the mobile and the related services, no? The case of internet, etc. So for that is necessary updating that, revising the structure, and for that we are also aware of this relevance to update the structure in the measurement that we have in the business surveys and also reflect them accordingly in the national accounts. In fact, this year in September, if I remember well, David, we launched the new base year of national accounts that is referred to 2018. That is the result precisely of the last economic census that we have in 2019, referred to 2018. So with this overview, we are now in the idea in 24 for carrying out the census in 24 with the reference year 23, and of course our plan is updating the weightings in the measurement that we have in surveys and national accounts. Okay, let me continue with the usefulness for the users outside INEGI. The first users are ourselves in order to consider the usefulness for the other programs that we have at INEGI. Now, in the case of the public sector, strategy really is strategic for policy making. Definitely, we have a lot of interaction. My colleague David Maravilla, that is present here, of course, in touch with many of the branches, many of the agencies in the Mexican government for really finding the usefulness of the information that we are producing at INEGI and be in touch, receiving this input that is necessary for creating this synergy in the right direction. In the private, of course, for decision for the markets, and in the case of the academic, I pointed out the relevance that is also for you. The case of the information that we have is published in the economic field, and you can find in www.inegi.org.mx, that is our website. It's common for many of you, I'm sure, and we have a dedicated section, a sub-site in the website of the whole website of INEGI for providing this information that is very, very complete, very detailed, and is strictly connected with the other product that I will explain. Some results rapidly, just to be aware about the potential of the economic census is, for example, in this dimension, the case of the municipalities. I would like to highlight, for example, the case of the municipalities, for example, those that are related more strictly to the manufacturing activities. No? Not all the country is with this profile. It's more common the case of the third sector, trade and services particularly. This is part of the reality that we have, not strictly in Mexico, in many parts of the world. And with that, we have, for example, that in the manufacturing municipalities as Toluca, that is in the center of the country. Toluca is the capital of the Estado de Mexico. The municipality of Juárez, that is in the border with Texas, in the other side is El Paso. You can see, so these municipalities that are showed in orange, in red, sorry, that are in red. In orange is the rest of the country. So if you can, for example, identify the presence, the relevance of industries as the automotive, of course, the municipalities that are in the states of Aguascalientes, San Luis Potosí, Coahuila, Puebla, Guanajuato, Chihuahua, at least until Guanajuato, that is in the case of red, is now, why? Because we have a lot of factories there, of many global enterprises, as Nissan in Aguascalientes, as GM, General Motors in Guanajuato, specifically in the municipality of Silao, etc. So with that, we can identify also specifically what is the profile and the proclivity of the some areas that we can also choose in our investigations in the case of the economic census. So let me go rapidly to the case of the Statistical Directory of Economic Units, that is the DENUE by its acronym in Spanish. First of all, it's very important to be aware, as I pointed out at the beginning, that the SBR, our RENEM, the acronym in Spanish, is the infrastructure that contains basic and updated information that we have now in this current perspective and historical about the establishment of economic units, basically for recognizing this infrastructure with the economic census as the backbone for producing economic statistics. So the SBR in Mexico has particularly an advantage, and we are really proud of this product, because the Statistical Division of United Nations now is promoting the use of the geographical information to be included also in the Statistical Business Register of the countries. We have this information 13 years ago. We started in 2010 with this information in our DENUE, in this directory. So we started these activities of linking the geospatial information with the statistical information 13 years ago. Now, in 23, the Statistical Division of United Nations is recommending that. So fortunately for us, we are proud of this, as I pointed out, because we have this experience as an example for other countries. In fact, we are in touch now with countries in Europe, for example, in north of Africa, as Morocco, etc., for providing some our experience using the geospatial information in our Statistical Business Register. And for that, fortunately, you have, as users, the availability of the information that is produced in the Statistical Business Register in a public part. This part is the top of the iceberg, as you can see. And in this iceberg, we are strictly considering, for example, variables that are useful for the studies of business demography, how many births, how many deaths, if we have survivals in the establishments, of course, we have this interest to identify them. The statistical design of business surveys, of course, the samples, be aware of the updated frames that we need for carrying out the business surveys, and with this historical perspective, the longitudinal studies. So this top of the iceberg is the opportunity to really be near of the users for providing this useful information for this kind of analysis that we are showing in the top of the iceberg. So what are the public variables that are useful for this purpose that I mentioned in the prior slide? The identification of the establishment, this is the advantage because it's the opportunity to check in several times if we have this establishment or not. No? So this is one of the most relevant issues, the location, to identify the impact at regional level. Economic variables, for example, as the number of employees. We don't have specifically the number of employees. However, we have, fortunately, strata of number of employees. We have 7 strata that are useful for providing info about if the establishment is micro, medium, small, etc. And we have several categories, 7 particularly. The contact with a respondent, obviously with the authorization of the respondent to publishing this information. And finally, control of the information that we have, that is a code for identifying in much more easy way the establishment that we can refer. Okay, how are updating the Statistical Business Register and the DENUE, our national directory? As you can see, in the years that are ending in the years 9 and 4, we are carrying out the economic census. The economic census is the pillar, the main pillar to update in a whole perspective all the Statistical Business Register, of course the DENUE, that is the top of the iceberg. In the middle, we have the case of updating strictly the most relevant establishments according to the revenue. So we are naming these establishments as the business priority group. If you consider, for example, rapidly a numeralia, some numbers, we have now in our SBR in Mexico, in the Directory of Economic Units, 5.5 million of establishments. And in the case of the business priority group, we are considering 300,000 establishments. See, this is the more relevant in terms of revenue. For example, if you can consider the share of revenue in the total amount, these 300,000 are approximately 80% of the revenue that we are collecting through the economic census. So definitely we are in this target with the idea to collect this information that is useful, especially to update the samples that we are using for purposes of the business service and national accounts. Okay, some characteristics. So with this idea of the scenario of the SBR and the DENUE, how are the characteristics of the DENUE? We have three elements, the three components that are related strictly to the sources of our DENUE, that is the usefulness of the geographic information that we have in the same institution, INEGI, the G of INEGI. Technology, very important. We have in our teams very smart people working in the development of systems to provide these products in the website of INEGI. And the other side, the pillar, the statistical information that we have as a result of the economic census and all the programs that are feeding our directory. Well, the more characteristics of our DENUE. DENUE finally is providing information on the identification and location of all active establishments in the national territory and presents them with geographical reference in digital cartography. The advantage is that we have a complete information regarding the address, the name of the establishment, and very important is also the coordinates, the geographical coordinates to identify in the digital cartography where is located the establishment. So this scenario is the possibility to visualize the establishment that we have in the territory for studying, obviously, the regional impacts that we can also have at this level. And I would like to mention that particularly 22 variables that were approved by the Board of Governors at INEGI, that this is the idea to keep the confidentiality, of course, because our essence in the statistical office that is common in the world is keeping the confidentiality. And in this case, the DENUE is certainly publishing name of establishments, the location, the size, the economic activity, but we don't have particularly information regarding the economic activity as such. In this case is, for example, we are providing information regarding revenues, expenses, specific amounts of these variables. It's important to let you know that because many times people abroad of Mexico is asking, what, are you talking about really keeping confidentiality? How is it? Yes, we are keeping confidentiality because we are not providing specific details on the amounts of the variables, economic variables that we are collecting in that. So it's important to keep in mind this clarification. So more on the characteristics of the DENUE, the concept of interactive, DENUE interactive directory is because provide the opportunity, for example, if you are an owner of an establishment, you can do directly an update of your information because it's also the opportunity to provide info about your own establishment, the activity that you are doing. If you, for example, have the interest to publish information about the products, services that you are offering to the consumers, it's perfect for us. We can provide a specific subsite in your information to give this kind of data and information to the consumers. So important to point out, Jim, as we discussed it earlier today, is the download of the information that the DENUE has is absolutely for free. for all the users. It's a great advantage. In other countries, you need to pay, and it's not really cheap paying in this kind of information. So for us, it's really a great advantage providing this information. Okay, continue with that. I would like to comment that in the case of the IAOS for the mobiles, the Android platforms, we have, in this case, an app with the advantage to provide also the DENUE for using the mobile. The characteristics of the DENUE is especially, we have information that many tourists that came to Mexico are using the DENUE for investigating where are some establishments related to touristic services, something like that. It's also part of the activities interesting, and so you are also invited. Perhaps my Mexican colleagues also can check in the side of Mexico what are the interesting activities that you can do in the touristic perspective. Okay, so rapidly to show some of the aspects that the DENUE, that is particularly, I really like the product because it's the opportunity to really involve the two main pillars of the information that is produced by INEGI, that is the geographic information and the statistical information. So for that, it's useful for promoting economic units, especially for customer and supplier development, understanding the labor market in several regions of the country, frameworks to conduct market research, identifying units affected by natural disasters. Unfortunately, last month was terrible, the tragedy that we have in Guerrero, in Acapulco, basically. And for that, I would like to mention that particularly our president, Ms. Graciela Márquez Colín, was in touch with the federal government of our country, especially giving information of the DENUE. Why? Because it was the opportunity to show how was Mexico before the pass of Otis and afterwards, in order to identify the dimension of the impact in Guerrero, basically in two municipalities, Coyuca de Benítez and Acapulco. Obviously, there are other municipalities also affected by the hurricane, and in this case, it's useful as an instrument, a tool to evaluate also this kind of impact. So for that, we are proud of that. Of course, we don't want to use this kind of information in the tragedies, but of course, it's really a potential to have this information for this purpose. And particularly, for example, in the case of the private sector, we have interesting information about the use of, for example, to identify where can I check the location of providers, consumers in an enterprise, because with that, this is a real case, an establishment that is dedicated to the repair of electric engines, used the DENUE for identifying, in this case, the target businesses for providing their products, and also for checking where are the providers. With that, we identified that fortunately for this establishment, the increasing of its revenue was really incredible. So we are really proud of this usefulness of the information. And rapidly, some results is, for example, you can do directly the consultation in the website. Of course, if you agree perhaps in another session in coordination with our colleague David Maravilla, we can coordinate a training perhaps regarding the use of the DENUE in order to show the details, the advantage that we have in order to use accordingly the tool that we are provided. For example, checking the case of Mexico City, you can identify in this opportunity the museums and other artistic and cultural services in the area of Chapultepec. It's really nice in Mexico City. Other kind of consultation, for example, is showing in the case of Puebla, you can identify, for example, the ratio, creating a circle of the interest area for identifying the establishment that you are looking for. So with this idea, you can do a consultation, and for example, other possibility is in the city of Guadalajara. We can also combine the information that we have as other geographic programs that we have at INEGI, the infrastructure in the geographic information side that we have also available in INEGI. So many thanks for your patience, and of course, I'm looking for receiving comments, questions, and thank you very much again for the invitation. Much appreciated.
I'm going to stand up and let's see. I need to escape this. There we go. And, see, do you know, how do I get this to the, yeah. I'm a Mac person. This is a PC. I once was at a talk given by a Nobel Prize laureate in physics. And it was this years ago. They had overheads. He couldn't turn on the little machine that projected the overhead. And it was very funny. There were like 500 people in the audience, and everybody was a little bit embarrassed. He said, I'm a theoretician, not a practitioner. Yeah. Well, it's okay, great. It's thank you, Gerardo, for this for that really interesting information about DENUE and the economic census. I'm really happy to be here because I use INEGI data a lot, and I've used it throughout most of my career since they've been on the web. I think I've been using it, so going back to sometime in the 90s. I'm not exactly sure what year. And it's as I said earlier, I think it's one of the most powerful, most competent, useful institutions in Mexico. I mean, it's really admirable what they're able to do. So what I want to do is then talk about some cases in which I've used this data. And the first case I want to talk about is measuring human development in the border region. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Human Development Index, but it was an index that tries to go beyond GDP and look at other aspects of human well-being. It's based upon, in a philosophical, theoretical sense, it's based upon what's called the capabilities theory of development. That development consists of expanding the range of things that people are capable of. And it was developed by a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Amartya Sen, with a colleague of his, Mahbub ul Haq, who was at the United Nations Development Program. And their goal was to really provide a broader set of indicators so that we wouldn't focus so exclusively on GDP. It's still very limited in what it covers, because to get the United Nations Development Program to endorse it, they had to make a lot of compromises to do it. But they figured the things that are important for human development are, yeah, income, you need income, but you also need health, you need education. And those are the three things that the UNDP was able to accept as going into the index. Now, when you read about the development of this, you understand that they also were quite concerned with things like environmental quality and political and civil liberties and gender equality and these other aspects of human life that not every country at the United Nations was agreeable to having measured inside their country. And so those things didn't make it. But they settled on these three things of health, income, and education. So what my colleague and I tried to do, Joan Anderson was retired now, professor at University of San Diego. We wanted to measure in the border region human development and compare it in some sense to income. We defined the border as municipalities that touch the border and counties that touch the border. So a municipio in Mexico is kind of similar administratively, geographically to a county government. The difference is that there are no cities within municipios at the sub-municipio level, as there are in counties, right? So we use San Diego County, the municipio of Tijuana. We do this for the whole border. It covers the whole border, from San Diego, Tijuana to Brownsville, Matamoros, and all of the counties and municipios on the border. And we wanted to do it, you know, this was, I think, in some ways, one of the best contributions of this, and was made possible by INEGI's data. We wanted to do it in as symmetrical as possible way so that the Mexican data would be comparable to the US data. That, in other words, we didn't want to have a data series which couldn't talk to each other, that they just were not comparable in any sense. And we felt that it was important to treat the border region, both sides, in an equivalent way, and to not make a distinction based upon in the US or in Mexico. This resulted in this publication, the book, 50 Years of Change on the US-Mexico Border, and that came out in 2008. And then also a number of papers have come out where we've updated the HDI over time. So I think I talked about a number of these things. Oh, so here's the problem that you run into. So if you look at what the HDI is for the United Nations, you can't really get precisely the exact same variables in the border region, but you can get things that are quite similar. So for example, in the United Nations HDI, they use human longevity. So what's your life expectancy at birth? How many years can you expect to live? That's not measured in the border region. But we do have infant mortality. And infant mortality is highly correlated with longevity. So we substituted that, right? And we had to make, in the case of education, we had to make a few changes as well. It's a combination. The education variable is a combination of enrollment for kids, I think it's 5 to 18 or 5 to 16, I'm not sure, how many are enrolled in school. And then for the adult population, it's the percent of the adult population with high school or more. So a measurement of the educational attainment. All that data is available on INEGI's website, a lot of it in the economic census and others in the census of population and housing. Income proved to be a big hurdle as well because as you probably know, or maybe not, I don't know, but Mexico does not measure the equivalent of GDP at the municipal level. It measures it, so it has GDP, their GSP, gross state product, for Baja California and Coahuila and the other states, but not for Tijuana, Tecate, Mexicali, et cetera, right? So that looked to be kind of a big hurdle, but here's the thing, is that INEGI does measure state GDP. It also measures the sectoral contribution to the gross state product in each state. So in other words, how much does manufacturing in Baja California contribute to overall GDP of Baja California, right? So we know manufacturing is X percent of GDP in Baja California. Well, we also know, thanks to the economic census, what share of the labor force in each municipality is in each sector. So we made the assumption that if Tijuana is 40% of the overall state labor force in manufacturing, and manufacturing produces, say, $100 billion worth of output, then Tijuana's share is going to be 40% of that. Now, this introduces a bias, a little bit of a bias, because we're assuming that the productivity in manufacturing in Mexicali is the same in Tijuana. And that may not be the case, but I think it's a good it's a good estimate. It's a good sort of first cut at this, and it's provided a number of insights. For example, we see that the health differences, infant mortality, on different sides of the border, it's really not very different. I mean, there's really not a significant amount of difference. There are Mexican municipios that are better than American counties in terms of infant mortality. Education, there's still a gap. It's been closing, but there's still a gap. The big gap is really in income, where there is still a significant difference in income levels. So that was one project, which is, we've updated this a number of times in journal articles, and that's gone along. The other thing, this is a book that I just finished, will be out in February. Another project that I used INEGI data for extensively was to ask the basic question, are communities on the border integrated economically? Are they economically integrated? And what I did was I was very clear to define economic integration in the way that economists define it. So that means that there's two kinds of aspects to it. One type of integration is there's no difference, right? So incomes in Tijuana the same as incomes in San Diego. Well, we know that's not the case, right? We know so that integration doesn't exist. But closing the gap, right? So that's the first one is that the income level, that's sort of the state of things. Where are we at now? The other type of integration is saying, well, there's a difference, but the difference is shrinking over time. This is a process, right? And so the real question, we know that incomes in Tijuana are not the same as incomes in San Diego on average, but is the gap closing? That was the question. And the way that I proceeded on this was I used 14 on the U.S. side are called core-based statistical areas. So these are metropolitan and micropolitan areas that are the main urban areas on the U.S. side of the border. Each of them is a twin city with a Mexican counterpart, and each of them has at least one port of entry. And between the two, the Mexican side and the U.S. side, these 14 conurbations of urban areas are 95, 96% of the population living on the border. The border population is really urban. It's very urban, right? So if you look at these 14 pairs, you've got 95, 96% of the population, right? So that's what I focused on. And looked at the period from 1980 to 2019. I stopped in 2019 because of the pandemic. I could have gotten data for 2020, but that data is all skewed because of the pandemic. So I stopped it in 2019, and asked the question, you know, so are communities integrated economically? The answer is no, we're not. We're not integrated. And I think this is an important point, because that's not the interesting thing. That's kind of not surprising. If you think about just your gut feeling of the differences, that's not so surprising. But here's what's interesting. All the interaction. There's so much interaction. So a lot of what that book deals with, and it uses INEGI data for this, is to show how communities on the border are interactive. And how, over time, it takes a kind of an economic historical perspective on this, how over time, conditions on each side of the border have been shaped by what's happening on the other side. You know, to give you one example, for example, I have a chapter on tourism and the growth of tourism in the border region, which is a really fascinating story. You know, and we know that this was really one of the main factors that propelled the growth of Tijuana in its early years was the growth of tourism, right? And that's continued on. It's continued on. It's today, if you think about it, and this is difficult to measure, but if you think about it, how much of the San Diego economy, how much of the San Diego economy would be as it is without the cross-border labor force? right? That the presence of Tijuana shapes San Diego in some fundamental ways. We're not economically integrated, but boy, are we hyper interactive in the going back and forth and whatnot. So part of what my goal was, we all hear all the discussion constantly. I think it's in the news. People want to portray us as, it's really just one city, we're the el tercer país, is the border economy, et cetera. And okay, I think there's a kind of boosterism, and that's a kind of aspirational view of it. But I wanted to take a really strict definition used by economists to talk about whether or not we are integrated in the sense that economists talk about it. Answer no. But then what are we? What is it that's going on? Because it's not the case that there's, that one side never touches the other side. I mean, it's completely the opposite. So I just found, I found that partly the book is economic history, looking at the growth of different sectors along the border, manufacturing, agriculture, et cetera, showing how one side has shaped the other side. And then the last project I'll talk about, does Mexico need NAFTA or the TMEC? Does it really need it? And as I was telling Gerardo before, this paper argues no, and I haven't convinced anybody. I haven't convinced my co-author that this is the correct result, right? But and I want to also plug in this. I want to really give you an awareness. There's this fantastic resource that you can download for free on the INEGI website, which is Mexican Historical Statistics. It's a great resource if you're interested in the economic history of Mexico. It's a really wonderful resource. So yeah, we published this, and we estimated a gravity model. We said, hey, look, you can explain U.S.-Mexico trade with proximity and income, and you don't really need the trade agreement. And my point is, as an economist, I'd say, look, you guys, we're all too focused on the trade agreement. That's what's important are the reforms that Mexico put into place that really opened up its economy, and that was unilateral, and that's what really drove things forward. What prompted me to go down this avenue was, remember back in 2016 when we had a president that was talking about, well, maybe we'll just cancel the agreement with Mexico, and I started wondering, well, what would happen then? What would happen if that happened, right? I think that without the agreement, there'd still be a lot of trade. As I said, I haven't convinced anybody of this. I'm not really trying to, but even my co-author, I think, disagrees with me. But anyway, INEGI data made me go down this wrong path, perhaps. But I just think, it's a tremendous resource. I'm so glad they're going to open up a data center here. And I think if you guys haven't looked at their website, play around with it. You just got to play around with it a bit. It's got so much information on it. I mean, it's really incredible. So thank you.
All right. Well, thanks so much, James, for that presentation, and Gerardo for setting the stage. So I'm a development economist, and development economics has moved a lot in the last couple of decades towards using randomized controlled trials to try to understand the effect of policy. And so I'd like to just start off by saying how important Mexico has been in that evolution of the way that people think about evidence in the development space. So the randomized controlled trial that was the initial evaluation of Progresa, of Oportunidades, was really like the thing that got this entire ball rolling. And when I was a graduate student, that was like the only study that existed. And so there were, 200 or 300 papers written on that data set in the course of a few years, because it was kind of the only thing that was there that people could use. Okay, now I'm similarly flailing with, I guess I can do it that way. Okay. I've been, privileged to be able to work with a number of different Mexican researchers on randomized controlled trials. So just to kind of set the stage of where this whole thing came from. So in 2007, we were approached as a team, a group of researchers who were at COLEF at that time, Gerardo Ordóñez and Tito Alegría and René Centeno, to see whether we could do an evaluation of a program that is called Programa Habitat. So this is a major kind of slum infrastructure investment program that is going into marginalized urban neighborhoods that are infrastructure poor and trying to make investments in those neighborhoods in a coordinated way, where the idea was to do a lot of things at the same time. So it's not just, that you come in and pave a road or you bring electricity, but the idea is you do a whole bunch of things at the same time. You do those, you bring in sewerage, you bring in sidewalks, you put in streetlights, you build community centers, you build parks. So all of these are ways of trying to kind of create community in places that are marginalized and don't have a sense of community. And so it was a major program. The budget for Habitat was on the order of $150 million a year, but we did a randomized controlled trial that randomized $70 million worth of expenditure across neighborhoods in Mexico. So the previous version of that product, which we wrote a paper on many years ago, was based on survey research that we conducted. And this is the way that randomized controlled trials are normally evaluated, is you spend an enormous amount of money. In our case, it was almost $1 million that we spent just to do the research for this one project, to go out and do household surveys that you measure at baseline, and then you let the program happen, and then you measure at end line. And this was a way of trying to understand how these investments affected the households, okay? So we found fantastic economic returns to this program. Property prices went up by 2 pesos for every peso that the government invested in this program. We found huge changes in crime. So violent crime dropped by about 1/4 in the neighborhoods that got in this program. Particularly, there was a lot of change in the behavior of teenagers, parents reporting a lot fewer problems with their kids because their kids had parks and community centers and sports fields, et cetera. So we felt it was a very successful program. We had the communication with Cedesol when Cedesol still existed, and then we kind of put this project to sleep. So then I was approached a few years ago by a group from the World Bank, which included Leo Iacobone, who's done a lot of work on the private sector in Mexico, and he said, hey, are you aware of how good INEGI's firm-level censuses are, and that you can actually locate these firms all the way down to the block level, as Gerardo told us, right? So there's a Manzana ID, there's an AHEB ID that sits for every single firm. So you have this incredible ability to locate these businesses in space. So now, the way that this project worked was that Habitat defined neighborhoods that they called polígonos. So we all know the word polygonal means nothing, right? It means just like it's a shape, okay? So these neighborhoods that they defined don't correspond to anything else, right? It's not a localidad, it's much smaller than a municipio. So there's no layer of data collection anywhere in the Mexican data environment that is at the right unit to study this program. So we had made some efforts to think about trying to use institutional data, but in the end, it's like, well, this will be impossible because no one collects data in the way that we need it to study this program. So then what we've ended up doing with this project then is going in and using the fact that we have the exact outlines of the neighborhoods in which the investment took place. We have a randomized control group, right? So in other words, it's neighborhoods that are exactly the same on average, but that Habitat didn't make any investments in. And we also have the exact outline of those neighborhoods. So now this project has just been kind of one thing after another for me, of my jaw basically hitting the floor with amazement at how detailed this data are, and the number of things that we can do here to address some of the deep questions in this literature. Because what we're now thinking about this is like, okay, what this program basically did is like gentrify small neighborhoods. and they made them much more attractive places to live. They made them much safer. They made the property values much higher. The residents started investing in their own homes in these neighborhoods, right? So it wasn't just that the government did something for me. It was that neighborhoods that people had been moving out of very quickly, now they stay put, and they're investing, and they're putting in an indoor bathroom, or they're putting in a kitchen, or they're investing in new roofs. So we also found this huge increase in private investment as well. But now the question is, what happens to the private sector? And in the debate over how infrastructure affects the private sector, we have all of these very difficult questions, because maybe you made a neighborhood nicer. And maybe there are businesses that are making more money in those neighborhoods now, but maybe all of those businesses were actually like moving in from outside and displacing the people who are normally running businesses in those environments. What happened to the neighborhoods around you? If there's more investment in this neighborhood, is that coming from the fact that people would have built a coffee shop 10 blocks over here, and instead now they move it into this neighborhood? So in other words, you're doing better because everyone around you is doing worse. Are firms being created? Gerardo referred to firm birth and firm death, right? So how much of what's happening is coming from the churn of firms? And then what is the effect on public finances of the fact that we may have these incidental effects of this program? So it was a program that was very much aimed at residential welfare, but if it's changing business outcomes, then it's also changing tax receipts, and so it's having a public finance implication, okay? So then basically, that's the backstory for the project. And so then what I'll do is just kind of show you a bunch of pictures that are kind of illustrating how amazing the data is here. So I have a lot of slides that I won't talk much about. So basically, yeah, so what the program is investing in these marginalized neighborhoods. They have to be in cities with more than 15,000 residents. They don't invest in neighborhoods that have active conflict over land tenure, right? So they're not trying to deal with like giving property titles. They're only operating in neighborhoods where the residents already have property titles. And then, as I said, the majority of the investment is going into this construction of physical infrastructure, but there's also community centers, sports fields, courses on gender violence, et cetera. So just a couple of illustrative pictures here. So these are cherry picked, so I don't ask you to like find these so convincing, but these are just Google Street views within Habitat neighborhoods that are before and after. So it just kind of gives you an intuitive sense, right? That it's like here you had like some sidewalks, but they're beat up. The street is rough. There's no bollards that protect pedestrians at the street crossings. And then here you have nicely paved streets. You have well-built sidewalks. They have ramps. They have bollards. So, it's basically making the neighborhood more walkable. It's making it more pedestrian friendly. And then here's another similar example. Here's a neighborhood that didn't have sidewalks at all. The streets were almost unpaved. And then here's an example of what it looks like in the after, right? So again, this is not building highways. This is not, massive heavy infrastructure. It's just basically making these neighborhoods nicer places to live. So then the way the study goes is we have these 370 polígonos that are located in 68 municipalities and basically in every big city in Mexico. So this sample is, all over the country. There's 14,000 blocks that are within the study sample. And so this is this incredibly spread out, geographically large sample, which is the reason that it was so expensive for us to do the household surveys that we based the underlying study on. This is just a sense of kind of what the money was spent on. So the total is about $68 million. And then of that, about 53 million is going into some form of heavy infrastructure, with about half of that on paving. And then you see about $14 million being spent on these kind of more social community development things. And Cedesol, interestingly, they wanted to build social capital. That was like the actual stated goal of the program, was really to make neighborhoods that were marginalized more coherent, okay? Yeah, this is a little hard to see, but basically you can just see like everywhere in Mexico that there's a large city, we have some sample, right? So this is an extremely difficult and expensive sample to track. So then if we start zooming in, so here we're zooming in on Quintana Roo, So now you start seeing, okay, well, here we have treatment and control within a city, and now we zoom further in, and then this is what it actually looks like, right? So the overall, I think we're looking at Merida. So you have, sorry, that color doesn't show up very well, but that light green is the overall city, and then here we have the intervention polygons, and here we have the control polygons. And then you can zoom in even further, and then this is what it looks like as you start getting down to the block level, okay? So this is the outline of a treatment neighborhood, this is the outline of a control neighborhood, and so obviously this is an extremely demanding environment to map anything else onto it because you literally have to be able to put the observation onto the correct block. And that is something that the Censo Económico allows us to do. Now, very interestingly, it also allows you to consider the neighbors because this data set exists in completely continuous space. So always with these kinds of gentrification style programs, right? The question is, am I just improving this neighborhood at the cost of other neighborhoods, right? Are things getting better for these people because they're getting worse for someone else? It's a very obvious question. It's really a very difficult one to answer in general. And so this provides this incredibly transparent environment where we can just draw buffers around the study neighborhoods of whatever size we want, and we have every single firm inside the buffer just in the same way that we have every single firm inside the study neighborhoods. So it provides this very simple, transparent way of thinking about spillover effects, which is actually almost statistically identically well-powered to the way that we're thinking about the treatment effects themselves. So we use, so again, the program invested between 2009 and 2012. So it's just kind of dumb luck for us that we happen to have these perfectly spaced censuses from INEGI that are in 2008, which is a baseline year. I'm giving slightly, I think you were giving the year that you were preparing the reports and we're thinking of the year that the surveys were done, right? So we have 2013, which is kind of like a short-term outcome about a year after the program ended, and then 2018, which is 6 years later. So I think most of what I would say about the survey has already been said much better by Gerardo. So, very high response rate and the ability to link the same firms across different censuses is just such an incredibly unusual possibility. So we have, you will see the word underlined on this slide is obligatorio, which is another thing that's very unusual in our world, right? That we always do surveys that people have the right to refuse, and they do refuse them, and that's a big problem from our perspective as researchers. So to have access to a census that people must respond to is again very useful for us. So then this is just kind of like some of the descriptive statistics on the firms. I think let me jump to this. So one of the questions that you always get asked when you're running these randomized controlled trials, right? Because it's a very exact way of studying, but it also means that you're kind of looking through a telescope just at one little bit of the world. And it's very difficult for you to tell how does the area that you're studying relate to the bigger picture, right? So this is what we refer to as external validity. Is our sample comparable to the rest of the country or to the rest of the cities that we're operating in? And that's a question that we fundamentally couldn't answer at all with the previous study because we only did surveys where inside the study neighborhoods, right? So again, this kind of continuous space dimension of the INEGI data means that we can compare study firms to the entire distribution of firms in the city that the study took place in. So it gives us this kind of complete ability to think about external validity where we're comparing now not treatment versus control, which is kind of how an experimentalist normally thinks about it, but the study neighborhoods versus the rest of the city. Right? So again, a very unusual ability to speak to the universe here, thanks to the INEGI data. I think it was alluded to by Gerardo, but in fact, when you say a firm level census to people in the US, they have a tendency to think that we're studying Google or Ford. And so, in fact, the vast majority of the firms in INEGI counted by firm are one-person firms that are in the trade and services sector, right? That's of course that's not the majority of revenues, but it is the vast majority of firms are these tiny little firms. And so, we see here that like in our sample, only about 10% of all of the firms that we're studying are in manufacturing and about 90% are in trade and services. This is really, I think, an amazing picture to be able to draw. We call this the Napoleon goes to Moscow picture. But so what we're doing here is using the ability in the INEGI data to actually track the same firm. And so then what we're looking at is 2008, 2013, 2018. And what we're considering is what is the continuation, the birth and the death of these firms. So in other words, if you take the denominator is all of the firms that we ever saw in any of those three censuses, only 17% of the establishments that are there were actually there in all 3 years. So it gives the sense of the incredible rate of churn that exists in these firms, with firms being born and dying all the time. So here you see, 18% of the firms died between 2008 and 13. Another 13% died between 13 and 18. And then the green are the firms being born, so 15% being born 2008 that are still there in 18, and another 29% being born between 2013 and. So again, like this looks simple in a certain way, but this is such an unusual thing to be able to do, and it's only because of the INEGI data that we can do it. So these are our descriptive statistics. So again, look at the number of observations here, right? So in 2018, we have 1.5 million firms that we're able to study in this study, entirely coming from the relevant neighborhoods in the INEGI census. So then the rest of what I have to say is basically results, and I think maybe the results are not so interesting, so I'll just go through that very quickly. I mostly wanted to talk about what the data allows us to do, so this is just showing the experiment is balanced. This is showing, it turns out, this program has really large effects on private sector growth. So there's a lot of growth in revenue, there's a lot of growth in capital stock. The growth accelerates in the 5 years after the program ends, and that growth is found almost entirely in the trade and services sector. So if you get into kind of the economics of how neighborhoods work, there's no reason to think that making a neighborhood nicer would change manufacturing in that place, because the consumption of manufacturing is not linked to the production of manufacturing in the same way. But in trade and services, the people in this neighborhood are feeling wealthier, their houses are worth more, they're going out to eat more, they're walking around the neighborhood more. So, the taquerias and the restaurants and the coffee shops are all doing better, and those are all going to be small neighborhood businesses that are in the trade and services sector. Big effects on firm birth and death. Okay, so we can look at these. So this is basically showing that this intervention is killing off some firms, and the firms that it's killing off are generally smaller and less productive. And it is also giving rise to new firms that are being born in these neighborhoods as well. So again, speaking to this special feature of being able to talk about entry and exit. Let me skip over this. So again, like thinking about what kinds of firms are entering, it looks like the firms that are entering into these neighborhoods are bigger, they have higher revenues, they're more efficient. So those are all exciting. Now getting into some of the actual data that lets us dig into some of the details. So we're able to see here that financial services are a part of the story here. And so it is the case that what's happening is when the program starts, the firms that are based in those neighborhoods are taking out bigger loans and they're investing to be able to grow. So then the next question might be, well, is that happening? Are they able to borrow more because their land is now worth more? Or is it just that there's more demand? And then we also have questions on whether the business owns its own land or not. And so we're actually able to understand whether the firm can use its land as collateral. And we find that that isn't the story. So there's just as much growth in credit for firms that don't own their own land as firms that do own their own land, right? So we're really getting down into like a very nuanced, detailed story, which is extremely unusual to be able to do with census data, but the Censo Económico contains that degree of detail. We talked a little bit about technology. So here we're looking at technology as a mechanism. We don't really see that that seems to be the story. Like it's not that they're suddenly connecting to the internet or getting access to new technology. So it really does look like it's basically just simply demand has gone up. Formality was discussed, right? This is an extremely important part of the debate on firms in Mexico. And I think there's been, 20 years of focus on formality and what are the reasons for the high level of informality in Mexico. And here we're finding that actually this program drives formalization as well, so that these small, kind of, as we say, mom and pop firms are actually converting themselves into more formalized firms as a result. And then, as I mentioned, we can do this spillover analysis where we're able to now don't pay attention to the firms that are actually inside the intervention area, throw those out, and only consider the firms that are neighbors to the intervention area. And then we can draw buffers that are incredibly localized. So we start with just 100 meters, right? So, I mean, you're basically just talking about like one block on the outside of these neighborhoods, and then we can make these buffers bigger and bigger. And in general, we see actually shockingly no spillover effect whatsoever, no matter how we look at this. The program just doesn't affect the neighboring areas at all, which is in a way good news because, like, you might think that there would be negative spillovers here and that this is kind of like a business stealing story, right? That it's like my neighborhood has got better, so I'm just pulling business away from the neighbors, and we don't see that at all. So then, I guess the last thing I'll talk about is we were interested then in like the public finance dimension of this, because this is not really a story that anyone has ever had the data to tell. How does residential infrastructure investment lead to recovery of additional tax revenue through the private sector? And so what we were able to do here then is to basically estimate totals at the entire polygon level, total treatment effects on the specific areas where the government is able to recoup revenue from the private sector. And so we have kind of three core areas. We have the value-added tax, the VAT. We have payments to IMSS, which are directly reported in the Censos Económicos. So that's like, we don't even have to, extrapolate that. We see the variable directly. And then we have the 2% tax on total revenue, which is like reliably levied and corrected. And so then basically what we come up with is that just using these features of the program, just within the study neighborhood, there's almost $5 million of additional tax recovery per year. And so then that allows us to come with this calculation that basically in 14 years, paying no attention to this enormous effect on land prices, which are sort of a different mechanism for cost recovery, only through the private sector this program would pay for itself in 14 years through additional tax recovery. So I'll leave it there. I think, again, like, I'm very excited about the results, but I think the results are not the thing for today. The thing for today is that this data has enabled a form of analysis that we never anticipated at the time that we designed the study. It exists in continuous space, and it exists over long time frames that would have been unbelievably expensive to collect data, even as a sample that would look anything like this. And so to have a census that was there to be worked with has been an incredible resource for us. And I would like to particularly give a shout to my collaborator, Luis Sanchez Bayardo, who is the one who has been doing all of the work at INEGI in Mexico City. It has taken us 4 years to produce this paper, so my last plug will be to say it will be much more convenient to work with you if we're able to get access that is more proximate. So my thanks for the fantastic data and what it's enabled.
Okay. So, ¿alguna pregunta, questions? Okay, give me a minute. Good morning, good afternoon, and first of all, I would like to congratulate the speakers today. Excellent presentations. I really liked all the data that you're showing, and I would like to make a couple of questions. And by the way, I'm Alejandro Díaz Bautista, professor of economics at COLEF and fellow here at the U.S. Mexico Center. It's good to be back again. One of the topics I'm working on is economic integration. And I would agree that, yeah, we're at a level of integration that would be considered lower than other economic regions. Like I would say that, but maybe the economic integration started before NAFTA with the GATT, with the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade in the 80s. It's not that, but let's see the numbers and let's see how much Mexico has grown because of the two agreements, right? We need to see the numbers, and if it's true that everything is because of the distance, no, then why are we talking about nearshoring? And why did some firms went to China and they're coming back? So there are some other factors that are to be considered. And also for INEGI, excellent work. I heard about the Acapulco hurricane. That's an exogenous impact on the economy of Guerrero. How are you going to do the census after the hurricane? I guess you already did a census, and you need to go back and do another one, right? So that would be interesting. And the other one is, why doesn't Mexico publish an input-output table with the frequency as the other OECD countries? Because that's limiting our abilities as researchers. And Professor McIntosh, good to see you again. Excellent work. Not too many results, but also the impact of private infrastructure and the case of Guerrero. Was this private infrastructure as good as the public infrastructure that should have been used in the state? Because we see all the damages that the hurricane took from Acapulco, and mainly it was for private infrastructure, and we see buildings that were totally destroyed. So private infrastructure was not at the level of the other infrastructure, public infrastructure. And we have done some work with public and private infrastructure and regional convergence in Mexico. Thank you, and congratulations.
I'll go first. Thank you, Alejandro. It's good to see you again. Did integration start to happen under GATT? What I'm saying is that we're not integrated. Not according to the definition used by economists. We're not integrated. But I think something that's not well appreciated is that the U.S. began to take more than half of Mexico's exports in the 1880s. And that's been true ever since. The U.S. began to take, or to provide more than half of Mexico's imports around 1900. And that was true except for a few years in the 1930s, up until China joined the WTO in 2001, right? But it still is the largest supplier of imports to Mexico. So the trade between the two countries, this is a long-run phenomenon. This has been around for a long, long time. But what happened was that Mexico began to open its economy and to move away from import substitution industrialization, which I would argue actually served it quite well in the 40s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s. But when it moved away from that, its overall trade began to grow significantly. And the U.S. naturally got a big share of that because that's the way that we've been historically in terms of the close proximity of the two countries and trading so much with each other. Why are we nearshoring? Well, we all know that that's about political risk. I mean, it's like just-in-time inventory, for example. This is a great idea. Just-in-time inventory is a wonderful idea, right? But if there's an exogenous shock, if there's some sort of break, and you don't have any of your inputs in inventory, you're at huge risk. So similarly with nearshoring, we know that this is related to two things. One is the conflict between the U.S. and China, which unfortunately, in my view, has gotten too intense, and also related to the pandemic. That these are exogenous factors which are causing a reevaluation of what the actual risk is in producing in a place that's at a great distance from where the home firm is located.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Alejandro, for the questions. I would like to start rapidly in the case of the integration among U.S. and Mexico, because it's also important to take into account as part of the investigations that we did, for example, in the case of the Census Bureau here in the United States at INEGI. Here in the U.S., you have 13 statistical offices. In Mexico, it's just one. No? I think that it's an advantage. We have a centralized system to facilitate the interaction of the several units that we have in the case of the economic, socio-demographic programs, geographic, etc. So my point is, in the case of the integration, and this is a kind recommendation, especially for the investigations that we are carrying out and providing useful info for the analysis of the impact in the border, the statistical effects, for example, as a result of the trade that we have, international trade between two countries. I'm referring to the case of use of mirror statistics, for example. And the mirror statistics is the opportunity to analyze, compare, evaluate the statistics that we have in one country with your partner country in order to be sure that, I don't know, if you have, for example, an export of $100, you are supposing that the other country will import $100. It's not strictly $100. Why? Because there are other countries, third parties related, for example, the triangular trade in this case, many times now is relevant the case of Asia-Pacific countries, in the case of the Far East, China, I don't know, Malaysia, other maquiladoras countries that are relevant worldwide. So for that reason, we investigated 20 years ago with the Census Bureau and also with the support of the CBP here in the United States. What about the mirror statistics? In order to be sure about the impact in the case of the international trade, because many times we are considering a level of trade that is not strictly that level. Why? Because there are other countries involved in the middle, no? In this case, as China, that is part of the reality today. Just to mention that. Now, regarding the questions to INEGI, I would like to comment that the case of the impact of Otis was really a tragedy in Guerrero, and for that, as I pointed out, fortunately, our president, Ms. Graciela Marquez Colín, is in touch with the federal authorities to provide useful info for that. The usefulness now of DENUE, our National Director of Economic Units, is evident for that. In fact, Ms. Graciela Marquez is providing this information to the authorities for evaluating the establishments that we have prior to the hurricane, and now considering this timing that I explained with the update that we are considering for the economic census each 5 years, in the years end in 9 and 4. Next year, we will carry out the following economic census. We will have a new picture of the country, including, of course, Coyuca de Benítez, Acapulco, and Guerrero, Oaxaca, the states that were unfortunately affected by the hurricane, with the aim to compare with the picture that we have as a result of the prior economic census in 2018. No? In fact, the economic census was carried out in 2019, but this the reference information 2018. So with that, we are in this possibility. Fortunately, now the timing and, of course, the positive response of our Congress for finally support INEGI for providing the money to do the economic census next year is extraordinary and especially useful in this time of tragedy in the case of Guerrero. And thank you for asking about that. Let me move rapidly to the case of the input-output table that we are producing in the field of national accounts. You are right. The input-output table is updated each 5 years. The issue is that, as I pointed out in one of my slides, we are considering that the SBR, the Statistical Business Register, is the center, is the backbone to update many of the information that now is provided by the economic programs in INEGI. One of them is in the field of national accounts, the calculation of the GDP. The GDP is weighting, obviously, always considering the structure of the recent year, the base year, for the calculations. In September of the current year, we publish the new base year of national accounts that is centered in 2018 as a result of the economic census in 2019, the reference year 2018. So for that, we are considering the reference year, the calculation of the new base year centered in 2018 for all the economic programs, including the business surveys for the measurement in the short term, basically in the sectors that I mentioned, manufacturing, construction, wholesale and retail, and non-financial services. So with that is aligned the input-output table with this base year for all the economic programs. However, aware of this point that you are raising, and based in fact with all the agreements that we have with the Statistical Division of the United Nations, also Mexico as member of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, we are doing an important, a crucial effort, let me say crucial, in the side of national accounts for updating supply and use tables, not strictly the input-output table, but yes, the supply and use tables annually. So with that, we are we are providing this information in the side of the structure of the economic activities in the perspective of national accounts with the supply and use tables. So in the case of the questions, I think that is it. Thank you again, Alejandro.
Thank you, Alejandro. Nice to see you again as well. And also, again, let me give thanks to COLEF, which was absolutely the leader of the project that I described. All of the programming and the research work was run out of COLEF for that. So I think the question that you ask is a very good one, and like these pictures from Acapulco are just shocking of what some of that private infrastructure looked like. We don't have very good measures of quality. What we know is what was spent. And so I think the strength of the study that we have is not speaking to the question exactly that you asked, like which one is better. I think the strength of it is speaking to the fact that we can nail down the fact that there is a causal connection between what happens when the government spends money and how the private sector responds, right? And that's a very difficult relationship to untangle because municipal governments that are primarily responsible for infrastructure are quite sensitive to changes in neighborhood dynamics. There's a natural pattern of investing more money in places that are gentrifying anyway. And so, you tend to see these things going up and down together, but it's very difficult to tell what's causing what, right? So I think the special thing that we're able to speak to is not just that this public infrastructure causes households to invest privately in their own houses, but is also leading to this really large increase in commercial investment as well, which is, I think, a very unusual linkage to be able to draw. So thank you.
First of all, I want to thank all three panelists for the valuable information you just shared with us. I have a question for Gerardo. First of all, taking into consideration what you mentioned about keeping some information private, how do you think insecurity in the country affects the statistics of INEGI? Also, another question for any of the panelists is, how do you think INEGI statistics might help international relations students? Thank you.
Many thanks for the very interesting questions. Many times this kind of question is part of the discussions when we present our products. Worldwide, the statistical restriction that we have for providing results always is keeping confidentiality of the respondents. in the households, in the establishments, in all the fields that we work for, especially for the production of information. In the case of the economic unit, the establishments, as I pointed out during my presentation, fortunately, as part of the responsibility of INEGI, it's important to take into account our law on the statistical and geographic information system, because INEGI is an autonomous institution of the Mexican government. This is, I think, a potential to create credibility, especially in the population, about the activities that we are carrying out, especially in the field. When we are going directly to households for investigating characteristics of the individuals, the I don't know, dwellings, etc. So in this relevance, in 2008, we started as autonomous institution. In 2009, our Board of Governors, the starting Board of Governors of those years, particularly in 2009, approved the case of the DENUE, of this National Directory of Economic Units, to publish these 22 variables that we are considering. Basically, as I pointed out, the identification of the establishment, the legal name, the address, in fact, is based in a recommendation that is also provided by INEGI, a technical standard, to provide the address. I don't know, many times, here in the US is the same, avenue is complete the word or just the acronym, AB. Many times it's important to distinguish that with point, dot, or not. No, it's relevant. So for that, we have this technical standard to create this homologation of information in the case of the addresses, starting with ourselves in INEGI for publishing our results. So with that, this first agreement of the Board of Governors was key for this purpose. So the discussion about the public information is because the legal name, for example, many times you identify Walmart, a restaurant, I don't know, with the name in the street. You can show that this restaurant, I don't know, yesterday I enjoyed a nice dinner in Lemon and Salt, I don't know, no, in Del Mar Avenue, for example, Lemon and Salt. Okay, this is the name of the restaurant and it's public. So for that, you have the address, you have the name in front of you, no problem at all. We are not providing strictly the number of the employees, the amount of revenues. So for that, during the collection of the information, for example, in the economic census next year, we have at the end of the interview a question for the respondent to ask about, do you agree to publish the information provided in this questionnaire for the economic census? Yes or not? Always, many of them, not all, most of them, are no problem with me, you can publish them. In fact, it's the opportunity also to promote the activity of the establishment. And recognizing, of course, behind of us, this strong of our statistical and geographic information law, these rules that we are publishing in the technical standard for addresses, names, etc., that is relevant. And also during the interview, in fact, here my colleagues of the socio-demographic side is the same for all the programs that we have at INEGI, the information programs. We have in the internet the information about the interviewer that is designated to visit, for example, your establishment, no, or your household. It's part of the activities that we have in our regional fields operation area at INEGI that is relevant. It's a big country, no, more than 130 million people inhabitants in Mexico. So for that, this information around a big event as the population and household censuses, the economic censuses is relevant, informing to the people. Why? Because we recognize that the security conditions are not the best in Mexico. You know about that. So for that, it's important and relevant information in the internet about the interviewers, and obviously taking into account always this question at the end of the interviews in order to give the approval of the respondent to publish the information. That is great using at the detailed level of microdata for this kind of investigation related, for example, by Craig. Thank you so much again.
¿Alguien más?
I might just speak to the question about international relations. Like I think my opinion is that the entire world of social science, like everything in this world, is becoming so data-driven now. And in order to do good data-driven work, you have to have data. And so I would give an example. I think James referred to this earlier. The rise of China and the entry of China into the WTO is something that we know intuitively has been incredibly pivotal for the US economy, for the Mexican economy, and for the integration between the US and Mexican economy. But how exactly? So, you know, there's this very nice train of work that is looking in the US at what the researchers refer to as like the China shock, right? And so there's this really incredible sequence of papers that are sort of in trade and sort of in international relations discussing the fact that if you look at US counties that were economically specialized in the types of economic activity that China has a comparative advantage in, and now you trace back and you look at what has happened in the US to those counties, these are the counties where drug addiction has risen. These are the counties with mass unemployment. These are the counties that huge number of people have moved on to disability insurance. And these are also the counties where you see like previously Democratic blue collar constituencies now voting for Trump. So there's like, I think, a very direct tracing that can be done from the nature of the firm composition into the way that this big international relations shock has affected the US. So I think, you know, this is a very rich line of research. It's something that I think clearly would have a lot of relevance in Mexico. In fact, in some ways, maybe even more relevance in Mexico than in the US. And if you want to make any headway with this, you know, you have to have what? You have to have geolocated, spatially granular, sector-specific data on what the private sector is not only doing now, but was doing historically. And I think that's exactly what we have access to here.
Someone else?
Buenas tardes. Brenda Cardona, del doctorado en Economía de UABC. Actualmente, bueno, pues mi tesis de grado se va a centrar en los tipos de innovación, pero a nivel de empresa. Entonces he estado revisando la información de la página de INEGI, de los censos económicos, que la verdad para mí es una de las bases de información con demasiadas cosas, mucho que poder explorar. Me percaté de algo que ojalá que también lo puedan arreglar. No está el archivo de las variables. Afortunadamente, ya hace tiempo que lo estoy investigando, bajé, pero no sé si al no estar haya algún cambio. Entonces, creo que es importante para la solicitud de los microdatos. Y otra de las cosas que pues me he topado, he tenido que revisar muchos documentos para tratar de especificar o hacerlo más específica en la solicitud que quiero hacer. Entonces, no sé si el INEGI tenga alguna especie de capacitación, creo que la tiene cuando uno ya hace la solicitud, pero no sé si antes, previo, alguna forma de acercar más la parte de lo laboratorio de microdatos, es decir, como facilitar el pre, porque yo he tenido que revisar los cuestionarios, la cuestión metodológica, muchos archivos, incluso por ahí algunos videos de las cátedras que dan en otras universidades, y pues ahí he captado un poquito de información. Una de las informaciones era respecto a el tamaño de empresa, sobre todo en las temáticas especiales que es de ciencia y tecnología, donde no encontré ningún documento, pero sí lo escuché en uno de las cátedras, que únicamente se les preguntaba esta temática a las empresas de 20 trabajadores hacia arriba. Y bueno, pues yo empecé mi temática queriendo explorar también el tamaño de empresa y incluir a todos los tamaños de empresa. Entonces, ya después de encontrarme con esa información, pues tuve que replantearlo. Y luego después, revisando los cuestionarios, vi que había una pregunta también muy importante que tiene que ver con las mejoras, que es una pregunta que se incorporó en el censo del anterior, que es el del 2019. Y bueno, pues revisando ahí con la definición del manual de la OSLO, ante los tipos de innovación, pues veo que también ya están incorporando esa parte. O sea, antes se hablaba de productos o procesos totalmente nuevos y ahora ya también hablan de mejoras. Entonces, eso también a mí ya me dio como otra idea de volver otra vez a retomar todos los tamaños de empresa. Creo que lo están incluyendo nuevamente en este censo. Desafortunadamente, pues a lo mejor para yo darle seguimiento a las empresas, pues no voy a alcanzar por los tiempos. Pero ayer preguntaba a alguien sobre estas temáticas, cómo ella podía localizar, por ejemplo, todo donde se han hecho, por ejemplo, era una temática de ella para las trabajadores del hogar. En mi caso, pues es de ciencia y tecnología. Sé que hay diferentes instrumentos, pero sí de pronto a veces nos perdemos en el mundo de información vasto que tiene ahí el INEGI y también en la parte de cuando llena la solicitud solamente especifica y que diga cuál es la temática que uno quiere, a qué nivel si es de entidad federativa y no recuerdo el nivel de desagregación del CIAN. Entonces, sé que tengo que ser más específica porque incluso baja uno un archivo de Excel donde vienen variables, pero vienen las variables de forma agregada. Entonces, no viene un ejemplo como a nivel de microdatos, donde yo sé que se puede utilizar la CLEC, de la que nos hablaba también para identificar a los distintos establecimientos. Entonces, sé que eso probablemente espero que se dé en la capacitación del microdatos, pero a veces también me gustaría estar como antecediendo para ir, porque ahí menciona que puede uno trabajar el to file antes de ir para poder pues optimizar los tiempos. Entonces yo hice como me imaginé más o menos tratando de ver, decir, bueno, si es a nivel de empresa, pues tiene que traer la CLEC, tiene que traer estas variables y pues ahí estoy tratando yo como de armar una base como pienso que pudiera estar, pero no tengo la imagen que realmente se maneja en la base que tienen en el laboratorio. Y digo, yo sé que estas son a lo mejor inquietudes pues más de mi temática, pero que creo que en algún momento algunos estudiantes de posgrado o incluso licenciatura pueden toparse cuando van a explorar microdatos, que sí hay muchas cosas que tienen que ir a revisar para poder identificar exactamente lo que quieren. Entonces, esta es mi experiencia que he explorado. Muchas gracias.
Brenda, muchísimas gracias por la consideración, digamos, que haces y las preguntas. Tomo nota respecto al archivo de variables que no se encontraba o no se encuentra, esto lo platicamos de inmediato con nuestra área de laboratorio de microdatos. Y respecto a las solicitudes específicas para manejo de información, tenemos, digamos, un elemento común para todo lo que es el laboratorio de microdatos, pero también tenemos la posibilidad, vía nuestro equipo que está al frente del laboratorio, de poder ver cosas específicas, como en el caso tuyo, ciencia, tecnología, investigación y desarrollo, elementos que has comentado ahorita también, que podemos darles alguna asesoría, sobre todo para poder aprovechar adecuadamente el potencial de la información que ofrecemos a través de este servicio del laboratorio de microdatos. Ahora, como bien comentas, sería inclusive, si no muy costoso, realizar los censos económicos preguntándole a más de 5 millones de establecimientos 200 preguntas, que son las que yo comentaba. Sería muy caro hacerlo. Y algo que hemos observado en la economía mexicana, y esto es inclusive lo podemos extrapolar, llevar a otros países también, es que los aspectos de investigación y desarrollo, en fin, que han adquirido sin duda importancia en micro y pequeñas empresas, ¿sí? Siguen siendo poco significativos cuando comparamos ya empresas medianas y grandes, ¿sí? Que son las que llevan a cabo este tipo de aspectos de research and development, ¿no? Entonces, por eso también es un aspecto que nosotros, pues es un trade-off ahí que tenemos siempre sobre la mesa, y en términos de lo que cuesta hacer un censo, decide el INEGI centrar la mayor parte de estas preguntas en establecimientos más grandes, pues. ¿Qué hacemos en todo caso? Y esto también nos lo ha pedido la OSD, es cuando tenemos también los fondos necesarios, hablo de presupuesto, hacemos investigaciones específicas para ver este tipo de fenómenos que tú estás investigando en unidades económicas más pequeñas, ¿no? Entonces, bajo esa consideración, lo tenemos en cuenta y ya has mencionado el caso de mejoras, ¿no? Lo vemos en procesos, lo vemos en productos, por supuesto, el manual de Oslo, el manual de Frascati también para nosotros es importantísimo, son dos pilares ahí para tener la base conceptual de lo que estamos investigando. Y en el caso de lo que estás consultando, yo te diría después podemos con mucho gusto platicar en lo específico para darte una mejor atención y ver de todo lo que ofrecemos actualmente con lo que está disponible, sí viendo la restricción de que no tenemos temas de investigación y desarrollo que sí investigamos para empresas grandes en empresas o establecimientos más pequeñitos, ¿no? Esa es la realidad, pero tomamos nota y gracias, Brenda, muy amable.
¿Para una más? ¿Quién dijo yo? Allá, otra vez. Yo tengo una pregunta para INEGI. Estaba viendo las estadísticas del laboratorio de Harvard de crecimiento y de MIT de complejidad económica y la cantidad de información que hay a todos los niveles, a nivel macro y a nivel micro. Después cada país ha reproducido estos datos para su país, ¿no? En términos de complejidad económica, y México lo hizo con la Secretaría de Hacienda y el CIDE, ¿no? Y estábamos en la clase y lo estaba enseñando a los alumnos y me metí a la página de México y nada, ¿no? No sé si INEGI está interesado en abrir estos datos porque pues ya no hay datos para México. El proyecto se acabó para México, ¿no? Y el otro es para el profesor McIntosh. ¿Cuál es el periodo de vida de estas empresas Papa and Mom o empresas familiares, ¿no? que mencionaste? Yo creo que es demasiado corto, ¿no? Lo que estamos, 1 o 2 años de vida máximo. No sé si esto se toma en cuenta o es importante en el estudio, ¿no? Y gracias nuevamente.
Muchas gracias, Alejandro, nuevamente ahí por la pregunta y el comentario. Déjame ver nada más primero lo que tiene que ver con el Atlas. Y hace ratito también Jim lo mencionaba en su intervención, por ejemplo, ir más allá del PIB, ¿no? El Beyond GDP, pues es un elemento incluso que está ahorita en discusión, tenemos distintos foros internacionales para hablar qué podemos hacer, qué podemos aportar más allá de mediciones tradicionales. Y digamos, las oficinas de estadística siempre se convierten en un instrumento verdaderamente potente para, en distintas dimensiones analíticas, proveer información útil. En el caso del Atlas, bueno, se estuvo trabajando con particularmente Ernesto López Córdoba, estuvimos trabajando con Leonardo Iacobone, el Banco Mundial, nosotros mismos, particularmente el área de cuentas nacionales. No tendría ahorita información particular por esta parte que va muy ligada también con en el campo de las cuentas nacionales, que es donde entra, digamos, todo este elemento que es útil para el Atlas. Desde luego la información georreferenciada que tenemos a nivel de los censos es útil, pero sí es muy conveniente aquí tener en cuenta el elemento, digamos, cálculo de cuentas nacionales. Tenemos que ver un poco en función también de la disponibilidad, prioridades que tenemos en materia de nuestros programas y los recursos disponibles, pero yo con gusto verifico esta situación del Atlas que nos comentas con mis colegas del área de cuentas nacionales. Ahora, en el caso, ya lo señalabas tú y lo dijiste muy bien, los establecimientos micro, ¿no? Esos establecimientos familiares, incluso que tenemos muchos en el país, tomar en cuenta de un 100%, ¿no? 9 de cada 10 establecimientos del país que estamos censando cada 5 años son establecimientos micro, que van de 0 a 5 personas ocupadas, ¿sí? Entonces, bajo esa consideración, esos establecimientos, muchos de ellos inclusive de carácter familiar, como bien comentas, tienen un periodo de vida muy corto, es decir, nacen y mueren en menos de 2 años, es decir, hay una rotación alta. ¿Qué estamos haciendo? ¿Qué ofrecemos a partir de los censos económicos? Y eso pudiera ser también motivo después de poderlo platicar en alguna charla dedicada. Un tema que ha adquirido importancia a nivel internacional es la demografía de los negocios, vista un poco como lo vemos con la demografía humana, ¿no? Las personas que nacen, fallecen o bien migran y van habitando ciertas regiones. Bajo esa consideración, nosotros tenemos nacimientos, ya hablábamos de births, deaths and survivals. En ese caso, las unidades que sobreviven, bueno, nos damos cuenta que son unidades también que tienen alguna actitud, algún comportamiento de emprendedor con ciertos elementos que mencionaba también yo en la oportunidad, que los hacen reinventarse y que los hacen mantenerse operando. Ahora con la pandemia, lo que vimos, observamos ahora y que seguramente el censo va a reflejar el año entrante, el censo económico 2024, es precisamente el uso de las tecnologías de información y comunicaciones para la actividad de las unidades económicas, buscando, digamos, nuevos clientes, espacios en el mercado al cual pertenecen o inclusive modificando los giros a los cuales se dedican, ¿no? Entonces, bajo ese elemento tenemos un producto que es la demografía de los negocios y que se calcula, así como las tablas demográficas humanas, en función de lo que tenemos entre censo y censo. Digamos que con los censos económicos tenemos una medición exhaustiva y entre cada censo podemos hacer algunas estimaciones para determinar precisamente esta rápida rotación que tenemos de unidades económicas más pequeñitas, estos microestablecimientos familiares. Entonces, es un producto también que tenemos disponible y es propiamente un análisis demográfico de esa naturaleza. Gracias, Alejandro, nuevamente.
Quisiera responder en inglés para ser un poco más claro. Disculpe. So, I feel like, you know, one of the reasons that Mexico has been such an important country in terms of global research on development is you can call Mexico a middle-income country, but in some sense, Mexico is like a very wealthy and a very poor country at the same time. So I work mostly in Africa, and in Africa, you know, there are no large private sector firms, right? So the entire story about how the private sector affects welfare is through, you know, basically one-person businesses. And all of the programs about job training and private sector formation, they really are just encouraging people to go out and start informal businesses, right? So I think that Mexico is a very unusual and a very economically diverse country that kind of provides this huge spectrum of diversity in terms of the way that the private sector operates. And in a way, without the INEGI data, the natural state of affairs would be that we would only understand the large firms, right? But it's almost always the small firms that are the ones that are really critical to driving welfare among the poor, right? That's where economic livelihood comes from for the poor. So I think, again, like what makes this data source so unique is that in one place with consistent measurement, with exactly, you know, the same way of thinking about profits and revenues and employees and all of this, that we have a single data source that lets us consider this huge scope of economic activity that exists in Mexico. And I think it, you know, it ties to the previous question as well, that this ability to think about big firms and small firms in a comparable way is very unusual and very powerful.
All right. Thank you very much, Gerardo, James, Craig. Un aplauso, por favor. Okay.